So look, I want to start with something that Harsh mentioned during your session, which was about different countries, about who does it better. It was pretty clear from the anecdote you gave that you thought Britain didn't do it terribly well. Can you just give us some specific thoughts, specific asking points for what you think, how you think the UK could do it better compared to what you've seen at other countries? And then I'll get your perspectives on it as well. And then at that point, we'll open the floor to questions as well. So, Harsh.
Great, thanks. So Britain can do, and Britain does. And an example of where you can get much more value for money from investments is when you really integrate every program that you've got, whatever policy it is, you put a lot of learning around it, and you put a lot of feedback so that people are getting information, not just at the end of some innovation project, at the discretion of the people who've been funded to do that project, but actually from the beginning, the needs of everybody are designed, so you structure your innovation programs to get everybody's, to meet everybody else's needs, not just a few narrow participants who are in there. So I think that's one part of it, and I think the UK's industrial strategy programs have done quite a good job of developing that. And another thing that I think I see other countries doing better is taking a better understanding of the role of place, the value of local or regional initiatives that are joining up industries together, joining up infrastructures together, joining up supply chains and training through the planning system, through coordination mechanisms. The funding then follows because the value emerges. But I think that's where I've really seen a lot of benefit.
Thank you. Rachel, presumably in your work, over many years, you look at policy, the way that other countries approach policy development. Is there a big difference with the UK? And is there a way that that gap could be bridged in terms of our approach?
So I'll say first that one of my frustrations when I was in government was how inordinately difficult it was to get good information on exactly how other countries did things. It's something that I think we are not as good as governments as we could be. But some general differences, so to pick up on your points. We're an abnormally centralised country. And I think that feeds into most of our policy. And it does mean that we are, I think, very poor at regional decisions, and we have fewer eternal regional structures and institutions that make those decisions relatively long term. And indeed, because we are very, very centralised, I think we tend to change policy very rapidly. So I remember when I was in government, everyone was like, well, we had these catapult things, but we've had them for a while. Like, what's the new thing we can announce? Because we need a new thing that's ours, and they've maybe been around for about 3 years, and everyone was already bored of them. So I think there's definitely a kind of a challenge there. I'm slightly exaggerating for effect, but only slightly. And then I think the other challenge we have as the UK is we've had a whole model that has not really been built around manufacturing being a huge part of our economy, and a lot of the things that we prioritise in economic policy have been more about general open markets and competition policy. You could argue we're doing less well at those now, but generally those have been our focus rather than specific industrial strategy, which I think a lot of people have been quite uncomfortable with. And then the third thing, before I say something that's good, is I think, and actually this is true of other countries we've worked in, when I've worked in countries like Canada or Germany, I think we all do this. I'm not sure we're always brilliant at analysing our genuine comparative advantage. Every country has a hydrogen strategy. Every country talks about gigafactories. Every country has the same set of policies that talk about why they're going to be the leader in AI or autonomous vehicles. And, they're not all going to be. And we, I think, take our fear of picking winners to extremes. And if I had a criticism of the Greg Clark era of industrial strategy, it's that it was terrified of making choices. And so often we kind of sprinkle stuff around. On the other hand, and then I'll shut up, I'm sorry, Peter, I think we remain really quite good at defending one of our really massive core strengths, which is R&D. And that's often our saviour.
That's fascinating. So not every world-beating strategy turns out to be genuinely world-beating.
It's got 10 million attached to it.
Who'd have possibly known that? Jon, this fits in very nicely with what you were saying about both the the centralised area of policy making in Britain, where all the people in London, where, what was it, 27% of people use cars versus 80% everywhere else make the policy. And also the point that you were making, all about all the different applications we have for this, and that we have to think about the rural-urban split, and we have to think about everything else. Toyota, famously quite a big global company, how do you see British policy, and how, as a global company that has to make vehicles that go everywhere in the world, can you possibly try and tailor your products to go with, well, these people want this, and these people want this, and these people want this, and there's an enormous number of places on the board you have to try and cover.
You have to play to your core strengths. I mean, there are, the other day, there are almost 100 million Toyota vehicles on the road today, with 100 million customers in every country and environment, and you can do that, and you have to do it systematically and grow. But it is this local situation. It's this sort of term, global. Look at global and then apply it locally. The appropriate situation, the appropriate solutions to what you have. And picking up on some of the policy pieces, in the hydrogen strategy piece, the UK was the first country outside Japan to sell a Mirai. And we had 30% of the sales of the first generation Mirai in Europe. We now have around 1%. And that's because the seed funding that went into the infrastructure, which is what you, of course, need to run the vehicles, that started the process going, but it stopped. The rest of the world, Germany is a great example of this, went on. They carried on. They had a vision. And they've got 100 stations, Japan 140. In that short time that we're talking about, they've gone to that sort of level. And then they can support the infrastructure and growth. And that's because they do have a decentralized approach. They have a long-term strategy, but they have a decentralized approach and apply it appropriately. They're not necessarily thinking they're going to cover everything, but that ends up as a result. And from a Toyota perspective, I mean, I talk really just from the experience here, is that you have to have this range of products. You have to have something a customer wants to have and can afford to have and use and needs to have, and that's how you become better at what you do. In the UK's perspective, I absolutely agree. The R&D sector, the skills and why we sold the first vehicle outside Japan was here, but actually bring it to commercial end is another question altogether.
And as a gigantic company, you at least have the resources to be able to place a bet on hydrogen, a bet on hybrid. You're doing some battery electrics as well, all of those various things. Whereas someone like Teva, obviously you're a new company, you're a startup, you're doing hydrogen, they also do battery retrofits on vans. How, as a small business, can you even possibly try and take more than just one approach to future technology?
I think that our approach is to find out what is the best energy supply for a given use. So there aren't, although there are many choices in what you could do overall, the combination that we found provides the maximum payload and the maximum distance for medium-sized trucks is a battery hydrogen fuel cell combination. But on the how to answer the question more broadly, I'd say that's that we can get towards inclusive infrastructure, inclusive decarbonisation by making better use of data, by collecting data across all of the energy transactions that are happening around us. We've not needed to do that for a while because the way that we've had estimated bills for so long, we've had fuel that's been relatively affordable for a long time, and so we've not been so concerned about exactly how much energy do we need at any given location for any given device, whether it's a vehicle or a home appliance or a factory unit. We've been quite lax about that, but in the future we can actually put in that digital data infrastructure, and that will help us to get to target what is exactly the right energy solution for a given need, or what combination of them could provide the least overall costs. You can balance out other system costs as well. So I think that's the way forward. For our company, we aren't finding, I mean, there's a huge market interest in what we're doing. There's huge demand, but it's kind of latent demand still.
What do your customers want when you go to them? They say, do they go, we'd like a battery electric, we'd like a fuel cell driven electric? Do they just go, we need something that's cheapest and greenest and it doesn't matter what it is?
They're very excited by the fact that we have zero emission vehicles. I think we're amongst the first to market in our weight range. What they really want, though, is just the ability to transport tons over distance. That's the thing that really matters to them.
Which is really difficult to do on electric vehicles, right? Even though I know Ford is going full electric on the Transit range, which is a very interesting bet from a technology point of view, you think you can't do it without hydrogen?
I think you can do it faster and cheaper and with more resilience if you use a combination of electricity and hydrogen.
Yeah. And Jon, specific technology, kind of, how you carve up the pie question for you. How significant do you think hydrogen is going to be in the future in passenger vehicles? Because we can see the logic that you need it for long distance, you need it for haulage, but really battery electric, a lot of people think is going to be almost omnipresent in passenger cars.
I think it goes back to your resource side, first of all. What's the best use of your resources? I don't believe, myself, a personal view, that it's entirely battery electrification. I should state that. However, there is a place for battery electrification in a certain type of duty cycle. If you're going to do a certain operation, you're going to go and do a certain thing, it's perfect. And if you have access to power, 1.2 billion people have no access to electricity. Never mind thinking about, plugging in a vehicle. But you have an infrastructure in all those countries which transports fuel around and vehicles that do it. So, by mirroring and mimicking that, you can enhance the environment that you have. So I think there is a mixed, it is a diverse range of solutions. I think absolutely in passenger vehicles, we proved it. The vehicles use them. There are police vehicles running around London. There are taxis running around London. There are people, and in the UK, cars have done close to 5 million miles over the last few years in hydrogen. So,
Before we jump down the hydrogen rabbit hole, does anyone at this point have any questions? Okay, gentleman there, hands straight up.
Bob Dover from APC. Rachel has explained that we don't have a government with enough bandwidth to handle all of these challenges, and they want to get elected every 4 years, which is a good thing. But how can we help to encourage constancy of purpose in this very difficult and fast-changing policy area?
It's hard, but to give my answer, I think you have to focus on the fundamentals that aren't going to change when you make your argument. So the things that won't change are people are going to want to drive. I completely agree, Jon. Outside of London, they want to drive, and they want to do it in a way that is convenient and affordable. People are perennially concerned and will remain perennially concerned about living in an environment that is good and safe for their children and grandchildren. And that is fundamentally why they care about climate change, right? It's because, and it's the same reason they care about air quality, and it's the same reason they care about schools. So that remains the case. And I think the challenge all sectors and all technologically complex sectors have are, one, the issues they're concerned with often seem abstracted away from those basic concerns. So I think tying them back, and jobs is another, remains incredibly important. And second, that the government cannot be certain to, this discussion right now, which technology is going to work out. And they're worried about making bets that turn out to be wrong or lock them in. So explaining why and when you need to make certain bets and that they're not locking themselves into rabbit holes, I think is also very important. I think that's basically the argument you have to make.
Partly because I guess everyone is slightly burned by the diesel experience, right?
Yeah, we were talking about this before, that when we do focus groups, one of the things that comes up again and again and again is, well, the government told us to buy diesel, and now they're telling us off for having diesel. So why on earth should we trust the government ever again? It comes up every single time, and they have a really good point.
Particularly when they're being told to buy electric cars.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Exactly.
So what's it going to be next?
Yeah. Carlos Tavares made this example for years ago, who's now had his Damascus Road moment, but pre-Damascus Road moment, he kind of said, remember light bulbs, right? Remember when we all had those incandescent light bulbs, and then at one brief point there were those twizzly light bulbs, right, which didn't really work and didn't really light very well. And if the whole industry had been told you must make those now, right, and then suddenly LED lights come along, they'd have all been completely, scuppered by it. So it's dangerous jumping down one particular technology avenue when something like hydrogen, something else might come along in the future that actually proves to be fundamentally better in the long term.
I do think it's worth reminding them when this has worked, though, as well. I suppose the only other thing I'd say is that the CFDs and renewables were incredibly internally controversial. And they were very expensive. I mean, it was a huge amount of public spending, and you could argue an immensely regressive tax on energy bills that's funded it. But I think very few people now would say that hadn't been worthwhile, that it hadn't massively pushed stuff down the cost curve, that it had given us more resilience and it had given us more options. So there are case studies of success you can draw on.
If we extrapolate those case studies to auto, I wonder what the two of you on the auto side think, therefore, about the policy at the moment of winding down consumer incentives, whether it's for purchasing electric vehicles, whether it's for installing wallbox chargers. And the government seems to think it wants to use the pot of money it has to do chargers and other things. We'll come on to that later. But rather than paying people specifically to take those vehicles. What do you make of that? John, you can go first.
It's extremely difficult, of course. It's public money. It has to be spent properly and rightly and should be used to encourage. I think it's quite a tough one, and I often hear the argument that, why wouldn't you buy a battery electric vehicle? Because hell, it only cost me a few p to charge. So, why would I need any incentive? It's so cheap and easy for me to use it, and so on. The reality is not the case. You do need to incentivise things, and you need to do it quite carefully. So, it is certainly something that I think does need some relative incentive. Whether it's a payment towards is another thing altogether. You've got a huge number of older vehicles that can be put into better use than they currently are, used vehicles and so on. Scrappage schemes, you could debate whether that was a good use of sustainable resources. You should probably extend the life of vehicles as far as possible, potentially. I think, though, in emerging technologies, and hydrogen very much as an emerging technology, it wasn't here. We didn't have a car on the road sort of 7 or 8 years ago. This is so early in an energy transition. It needs some help, in terms of getting it going. Mm-hmm. Tapering it, I think, is certainly appropriate in the commercial world to take it out. So I think it is tough. I don't have I'm not the chancellor, I don't have to choose how to spend my money, but I do think there needs to be some incentive to make change.
Harsh, obviously you deal with commercial vehicles, very different, very TCO driven. Customers tend to be less emotional than sort of consumers when they buy their vehicles. Do you think incentives are still important to getting your customers over the line?
For all of the major technologies that have revolutionised our world, capital grants at the beginning have been very important, and then ongoing support for efficient performance has driven a lot of growth. So I think that as long as you taper them, as John says, that it is absolutely essential to bring on new technologies and to seek that continuous improvement. Today it's energy cost and climate, but there'll be constantly new priorities as we go forward. So I think that there's always going to be a role for that. I actually do think that the infrastructure is a massive headache, and one where government is uniquely placed to secure long-term benefits by investment. So, because it doesn't matter who the first buyer is, lots of people can benefit from the same infrastructure. So I quite support, in a context of constrained resources, that everything that can reduce the cost of delivered energy and make it more efficient and better planned is quite helpful. I'd just go back to the question about how can we go through electoral cycles of 4 years. And I think that one of the routes that I've seen effective to do that is work at multiple levels. So you can work at local and regional. You can also work at multilateral levels with other countries. And I think that we shouldn't miss those opportunities as well.
And it's been interesting how, both the COP pledges and even Theresa May's net zero pledge that came before it has sort of locked in the direction, actually, in all governments, whatever colour, whatever stripes, are going in that direction, which is definitely, from a policy perspective, a good thing. I think the other thing we all also agree on, I imagine here, is that however inconvenient the electoral cycles are, it's better to have them than not. Thank you, that was a great question. Any other gentleman there at the back?
Cool. Are there currently any digital initiatives that you have going on at the moment in order to increase speed or decrease cost to help you achieve kind of the business objectives?
Thank you. It's a great question. John, Harsh, there you go, straight in.
Okay. So Teva certainly is using software, machine learning-based approaches to optimize how we manage the split between hydrogen fuel cell and battery use in the vehicle to reduce overall costs and emissions, reduce overall costs and maximise the for any given journey. We're also now looking to take that software, so it's not just on vehicle, but on outside as well. So you can optimise refuelling schedules and recharging schedules. If you can charge vehicles in the right order at night and refuel them without having lots and lots of hydrogen deliveries or not knowing exactly how much hydrogen you need to top up, then you can actually save quite a lot of costs. So software is going to be very important in this journey. I haven't got an answer on speed, or is it relevant stuff, but definitely on energy use.
And we're definitely going to talk a bit more about digital sides and how that can use energy efficiency and software and timing and stuff in the next session and after the break. John?
I mean, similar to what was mentioned there, I mean, in vehicles themselves, the management systems are crucial. Everything is about that. You can give a bunch of motors and a bunch of fuel cells or batteries to people and say, go ahead and do something. But without understanding how they work and controlling them, you won't get anywhere. And it's littered, the industry is littered with examples of that happening. So that's essential. The wider piece of actually absolutely integrating into systems about the energy dispatch and use, understanding duty cycles and prioritising and scheduling is all going to be very important. And now with car connectivity, or vehicle connectivity, that should enhance it. But I think we're still even now at the very beginning of that.
Can I ask a question? I feel like I used to read about autonomous vehicles much more than I do now. Why is that?
Sorry, that's because of us.
Yeah, but why don't you write about it anymore?
Well, so there was a great, as much as we have economic cycles and car sales cycles, there's also hype cycles, right, which are less measured by economists. But there was a tremendous amount of excitement a few years ago, probably 5 years ago, about autonomous vehicles. And Google had just broken Waymo out and they were doing autonomous vehicles and all those things. And then all these consultants came up with these brilliant kind of futuristic pictures of, cities without drivers and people sitting on sofas with throw cushions in the back of cars and all this stuff. And I remember being at a conference, in a meeting before a conference with a bunch of people in the room, and McKinsey were there, and they were asking us what we thought about this, right? How long is it going to be before autonomous vehicles come? And sorry, this is a tangent, but it's interesting. And they said, various options, 5 years, 10 years, longer. And most people in the room who worked in marketing or something like that, and apologies to anyone who works in marketing, put up their hand and went, yes, 5 years. 5 years it'll be here. And the one guy in the room whose job it was to build autonomous vehicles, whose previous job had been writing software for the Mars rover, right, whose brain would fill this auditorium, he said 40 years. Because it's a really, 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 really hard problem, right? And just this kind of, both the lane driving on a motorway is easy enough to do, but it's not really autonomy in the sense that it unlocks all the other features that we hear about with autonomy. Whereas doing it in a city centre is very difficult to do because of pedestrians and cyclists and dogs and all these other things, and mostly other drivers who, as we all know, don't follow the rules. So there has been what economists would call a correction there, and the hype is now much lower. We're seeing it build up slowly again.
Okay.
Thank you. That was a great question. Any more questions? Oh, there we got three over this side.
My question is to Rachel. Don't you think that the governments should be doing more to force the car manufacturers actually to side with swappable batteries rather than charging stations?
Sorry, siding with what rather than charging stations?
Swappable batteries. Because swappable batteries have been proven by Tesla. Even, I believe, Volkswagen have done a system with swappable batteries. And instead of using things like hydrogen, which I know is very good, it's great, but it's very hard to introduce the infrastructure, turning now petrol stations into hydrogen charging stations or even electric charging stations. If we look at those, there's not enough infrastructure for all the vehicles to charge.
So this is another of the sort of technology options that's possibly open in the future. NIO in China has done a lot of this.
Yeah, I think really the governments should be doing a little bit more rather than just sitting back and waiting for the car companies to come along and, we're going to figure it out ourselves, because the car companies never work together as it is.
Or when they do, they get told off for it. Rachel, do you have any views on battery swapping?
I will say that I do not begin to have the technical background to say whether you are right. I will only say, and maybe I'm too much of a conservative skeptic, that I get very nervous when civil servants decide which technology is going to work. I don't feel the track record's awesome on that. You may well be right. It may be unassailably obvious, and I would defer to others in the room, but it does scare me a bit when they do that.
This is one of the many technology areas where the kind of, there's interesting potential. The jury is out. Some have done it. NEO have made it work quite well in China. They've swapped more than 1 million batteries, but it's very expensive to put in the swapping stations. And it's a big question if they can roll it out in Europe. They're launching it in Oslo in 2 weeks. I don't know if I'm supposed to tell you that, but they're launching it in Oslo in 2 weeks to try and make it work in Europe. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works. China, it works because of the density of the megacities. Might not work in Europe. John, do you have any thoughts on battery swapping?
I mean, again, technologies will evolve, and so certain things will become possible, but the practicality of that and the pure raw material resource that you need in duplicating at some degree this, you still need the energy to be delivered to that point to charge those batteries. It's enormous. Maybe the digital world will unlock it, but I think at the moment, just the pure resource aspect is just frightening. We can't satisfy the vehicles themselves, never mind the swaps.
Yeah, I do think that something John's raised a few times, this raw material thing, is really important because we're just now at the beginning because of Russia and we're just on this trip to Saudi Arabia to understand properly the consequences of relying very heavily on regimes which we do not share our values, which we do not agree with, being faced with a series of very, very difficult choices about which we disagree with least. And we're now facing this with energy. We haven't begun to have that conversation on raw materials. And I think it's going to be a massive deal. I think a huge, huge issue over the next decade.
And probably one of the biggest fundamental global questions about the shift to electric vehicles, right? John made the very relevant point earlier that people are proud to have jobs. Toyota has an engine plant here. The heart and soul of a vehicle today is the engine. Right now, those are made in Europe or very close to the factories. Are we going to ship all of that as an industry fundamentally to China and let them do it? Will they do the heart and soul of the vehicle in future? It's a big question. It's a big geopolitical question about the shift to EVs. But you're right, we haven't actually genuinely, as a kind of community, begun to have a serious discussion about it. Do you want to come in on this?
Yes, I was just to go to the question. So I'm quite inspired. Our CEO, Asher Bennett, spent a lot of time working on battery technologies, fairly confident that the practicalities of on the vehicle side could be solved. And I recognise what John's saying about the station side needing to make sure that any batteries are well used. But where I think this is kind of breaks down is the way we make decisions. And actually, if I can challenge Rachel on the point that you made about civil servants not making good decisions, I think actually Britain needs to take a much bigger risks in technologies. I think we should think about much more 80-20, that we invest in a lot, and that 20% of those will drive a lot of benefit, and we should not claim to have the knowledge about which ones they are. So I actually think that we need more risk-taking and be comfortable with the fact that things won't work. But the way we do that at the moment, the way that we make decisions, is very much subject to capture by the largest, most powerful individuals and organisations. And so how do we take forward these future concepts which aren't top of the Rachel's priority list at the moment? How do we make sure that we engage citizens in the best way to get the right approach to choosing those platforms? Maybe battery swapping would emerge, maybe other things would come out of that. But I think that that's the thing that we need to innovate, is how we make decisions, because that's where it seems to be breaking down, I think.
Thank you. That's a fabulous point. Can we take the question from the chap who was down there? There we go.
Hi, I'm Nick Edge. I work with a lot of companies that introduce new technologies into the EV industry. First of all, Harsh, I think you've got the greatest shoes. I think everybody can say it. I was asked this week by a major OEM whether or not the process that we were talking about was a reduction in CO2 to the one that was being used, because they were looking at the total CO2 value of the production of the car. Do you think that's something that's going to come through as a government incentive and a tax, or do you think consumers are going to be looking at the tag on the car to look at the CO2 before they buy it? Is it going to be government or private push forward, and is it going to happen across the industry?
On the government side, I know that in discussions that they've had around the standard for low carbon hydrogen, which is a similar kind of proxy to the kind of issue that you're talking about, simpler is more likely than accurate. And I think that we have to be mindful that the ability to process and get through to a decision without lots and lots of bureaucracy up front can help people to move forward. So I think I've noticed that within the government side. On the consumer side, I've also noticed that when people choose low carbon vehicles, often, and this is also true for fridges or microwaves or dishwashers, they treat the A, B, C, D, etc. as a measure of quality rather than anything to do with the actual number of emissions. So I think we should work to what are people able to deal with? Are they able to deal with very complex but really accurate messages, or some people may actually prefer a simpler solution which doesn't take all of the embodied carbon, all of those things, and find ways to get those dealt with in a different way, because it may be just too much to overload consumers with at the beginning.
Well, that's a great point, particularly if we're thinking about reducing emissions holistically, right? Because obviously, as we all know, that what comes out the tailpipe of a car is a small fraction of what the emissions are from its life cycle, from the battery production, from everything else. And, you know, it's all very well saying this car is electric and goes, whatever, 200 miles. This car's electric and does this. They might have very different carbon things, but you're right. I don't think people in general are ready to sort of begin doing that major calculations to try and work out which car is genuinely greener in its life to buy. It's a huge consumer mind shift that has to go on through all of this, actually, as well. Did anyone else want to come in on this, or should we jump to the next question?
The only point I would make is there is no standardized, global, recognized approach. You know, it doesn't exist. So how do you actually make that comparison?
Yeah, exactly. Well, but you even see this with sort of, you know, different battery measurements. You know, oh, this car drives 300 miles in America, but only 280 miles in the EU. Incredibly confusing for people on the internet trying to do research. So, gentleman in the second row there had a question.
Hi. Just an observation to start with. One of the things I've been working in zero emissions and low carbon vehicles for the last 14 years. One of the things that still concerns me when we talk about hydrogen is the way that we produce hydrogen, and the fact that the majority of it is blue or grey hydrogen, that we're simply moving the emissions problem from one place to another place. And if we then start to talk about green hydrogen, it's the efficiency of hydrogen as a fuel put into a vehicle, as opposed to the efficiency of the electricity put directly into the car or the van. And therefore, you know, do we think that it's a good use of the resource, of bearing in mind we're saying we have a limited amount of electricity in the grid, that we then convert that into a fuel that's less efficient than the electricity itself to then power the vehicle? Or are we saying that there's a way that we balance that up by the use of hydrogen? I just, you know, after all these years, and I was a proponent of putting fuel cells particularly into long-range trucks and buses for many years, and maybe as a range extender, but I still battle with the thing of how we produce it and how we justify that move of emissions, because we just don't have green hydrogen going into all these vehicles right now.
Great, thank you. You've been reading my questions. John, do you want to take this one first?
I think very simply, I mean, historically, we haven't given a damn, have we? You know, we've burnt fuel, we've burnt coal, we've dug stuff out of the ground. We haven't had any recognition of that. So looking to the past is not going to help you solve the future in the sense of what will develop. So, you know, the byproduct of various processes has been hydrogen. I think the enemy is carbon, we're talking about here. We need to do everything to transition away from carbon. And by using the things that we do have in a better way and reducing that carbon will improve. But absolutely, you know, green hydrogen totally renewable hydrogen is what we want to aim for. We have an infinite amount of solar and tidal and wind power globally. You know, we can capture that and we can store it and we can move it. We don't have to move it as hydrogen. We can move it as forms of ammonia or other things, and we can use that. So today's efficiency problem is not a problem at all, honestly, for the future. We can address those things and we can do it properly and efficiently in the right place in the right way around the world. And distribution of hydrogen, whilst today mostly we use it in cars as a gas, you can put it in a pipe. Sure, we've got 3 times, or what was it, 300 terawatts of energy, I think, available storage in the gas grid. It's huge. It's huge. We can store an awful lot. But you don't have to send hydrogen just by a pipe. You can produce your hydrogen and you can put it down an electrical grid because you can turn it into electricity. So, you know, you can reinforce and it works together. So I think these issues today are things that we can solve entirely.
And fundamentally, one of your many slides earlier was talking about energy, right? Everything's going to go green. And unless you use it at the point of production, we have to have a way of storing it. And storing it will either be hydrogen or batteries, possibly a mixture of both. And so hydrogen is obviously one of the solutions for that. Harsh, you want to come on this?
Just, I guess it's really important to work out the efficiency of what. So the efficiency of various conversions, renewables to vehicles, etc., is no question there's an importance to it. But if you end up, because you're carrying quite heavy batteries around, doing many more trips than you would need to because you've got less weight, less payload available on your truck, then that's a false efficiency. It's not really overall better for anybody. And then a second point, I think Jon's raised about carbon, is that I'd much rather us get to 1.5 to 2 degrees by all means possible, rather than get to 2.5 degrees but pat ourselves on the back because we did it fairly efficiently. I think it's really important that we get to that, and I think that we really need all approaches to get to that. It's such a big challenge.
It's the old adage of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, isn't it? I think. Rachel, I know we're tight for time. Rachel, I want to ask you one question, which was the big kind of balancing act that you raised in your talk of the net zero versus the affordability issue, which we all knew was going to be an issue for EV adoption anyway, but now has really come to the fore. I wonder what you think the answer is, because you raised lots of great questions.
I mean,
which do you think wins out?
On EVs, it seems to be relatively simple, and it's partly your question, which is consumers will make choices on price. And they might feel very good about environment, but all evidence from retail and every other sector is consumers make decisions on price. So the question is it inherently cheaper, or can you persuade government to subsidise the price? I think that on consumer-facing technology like EVs, the government will back it. I think the bigger questions around big infrastructure and development costs with uncertain future gains, which is where it's going to be much more difficult.
Yeah, and is it the case that once everyone's sort of had this environmental awakening, we all care about environmental stuff much more than we did, and that will remain constant, whereas cost of living will fluctuate as prices do, effectively?
I think people will, so people will continue to be environmentally concerned. I think the only thing I'd say is it looks like this cost of living stuff might last a while, and we might be heading for a monumental recession. And two, when it comes down to it, however much people care about the environment, they will choose to heat their homes. And you have to be aware of that. If you can't make it cheaper medium term, it's not going to happen.
Exactly. Just kind of remember that a lot of people tried to reduce single-use plastic in the run-up to the pandemic, and then the pandemic came and everyone suddenly went, well, I'm not going to one of those shops where you all go into the same pasta pot to get your stuff. We're going to go for packaged stuff again.
And in a choice when, you could argue that the actual risk to most of those people of getting seriously ill from COVID was pretty darn minimal, wasn't even a choice.
No, exactly. Fascinating. I'm really sorry to the people who still had hands up. We're out of time. Come and nobble our speakers afterwards, or hold your questions and ask them in the next session as well. We're going to look at the issues of energy and infrastructure. But for the moment, please show your appreciation to our first panel. Thank you.